Very special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury for providing the Jag in this review, and of course if you are in the market for something like this, a specialised classic in this case, or even something newer such as a modern Jag, then of course you can get in touch with them or check out their current stock by clicking on the link right below this video in the description, and of course if you're in the southwest of the UK or even a little bit further afield, you can find all of those details down below. When it comes to reviewing a classic car here on the channel in Beards and Cars, I really do have to approach the vehicle and how I think about it and how I talk about it from a totally different angle to how I do with 90% of the other vehicles. That's not to say that I don't love classics and drive them here on the channel. I do, and I do. In fact, one of the most popular episodes I've ever done was for an old Rolls-Royce. I also featured last year a nice 1973 Ford Cortina with a lovely story behind it. And it's actually an unofficial goal of mine to have at least one classic car in each season of Beards and Cars. And so far this year, that is exactly what this is, a 1990 HE generation, to get specific, of the Jaguar XJS, an iconic Jaguar in its own right. You still see these on the road in the UK. Not all of them have been garaged or turned into collector's pieces or purely show cars, and that ties directly into why this car needs to be talked about now, because that is not going to stay the same way forever. Now, the interesting thing about this, and one of the reasons why I wanted to drive this one, because it's actually not a car which I'd initially intended to, but I happened to be at Affordable Prestige for some other business, saw this car and I thought, you know what? This is an important car in terms of comparing it to the Jags, which I do talk about. I've featured extensively the XK, the XKR. This is where those came from. And even though, of course, before this there were even more history, the E-Type, for example, this is a crucial car in the evolution of what would become one of my own vehicles, the 2007 aluminium-bodied XKR. So I was really curious to see how it would compare, but also because what made a car good or bad in 1975, 1980 whatever, 1990 whatever, would not necessarily be the same today. So can this car hold up, good or bad, by today's standards? Well, I will say the first 10 to 15 minutes of driving any classic car is my bedding in period. I really do have to get used to how floaty the old school steering on these cars is, and that's not a slight against the Jag by any stretch. The Rolls-Royce definitely had that, and even the little Cortina did, so it's just a classic car thing in general. I'm sure there are some that don't, but generally speaking, they're not going to feel as sharp as a modern car. In fact, it's one of the only genuine downsides, I would say, of most classics. They just don't feel as precise. However, what they do have, I believe, more than makes up for that. In fact, in every case that I've driven a classic, what they have in spades, and I've said as much, is charm. This car, despite being a Jag, which, to be completely honest, I've never had a huge amount of interest in, really pleasantly surprised me. As soon as I saw the interior with that wood-trimmed metal steering wheel, that big old boat-esque gear shifter, and just this super square but somehow still kind of curvy but not really interior of its time, which was really endearing. There's almost a feel of quality to it. Even if a classic doesn't have quality behind it, it just looks like the substance to the car. Everything's made of metal back then instead of plastic, and it just looks cool, even to a younger whippersnapper like me compared to the kind of people who had bought this car back in the day. Now, this car had a really, really strong production run. Started in 1975, ended in 1996. That is one hell of a run, and good on Jaguar for making it work for that long. It actually went through 3 significant levels, or stages if you will, through that time. From 1975 to 1981 was the pre-HE, if you will. That's where things all began. Then you have from 1981 to 1991, which is the HE models. This is one of those. In fact, this is one of the last ones, being a 1990. What the HE stands for, put simply, is high efficiency. What they did was actually pretty cool. They got an engineer in, I believe he was Swedish if I recall correctly, and he helped to improve the, in particular, fuel economy of the big V12 Jaguar engine. But a side product of that was to make it faster as well, which was great, because this engine in its time, and depending on the mileage, maybe even to this day, put out about 300 horsepower. Now, of course, from today's standards, a 5.3 litre V12, putting out 300 horses doesn't sound that great. But again, it's a much older car, and also it has a type of performance and a type of spec which I've said I really loved before, and I can definitely feel it here in spades, and that is lazy performance. Sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually a great one. What that means is an engine which, much like something as incredible as the Bugatti Veyron, is deliberately designed to never feel like it's working that hard. Sure, you can make an engine that's really tightly wound, something like a Japanese performance car with tiny capacities, huge power, and they do that really well, kind of like a motorcycle engine. But then you've got stuff like Bentleys, Jags, even American engines like the Corvette and the Dodge Viper. They're massive, they're lazy, and they never feel like you can really phase the engine. It's so big, so torquey, and so powerful in a real tangible sense that it feels like it just soaks up everything in its stride. What then about the performance? See, if the spec is 300 horsepower, even as far back as technically the 70s, just under 300 in that case, before the higher efficiency engines, well, actually the performance was really strong for its time. The initial cars were around the 7.5 second range, over 140 miles an hour flat out. Again, that's like hot hatch territory by today's standards, but back then that was a big deal. These ones were a little bit quicker, and then of course the final generation, if you will, the facelift under new ownership of Jaguar, where they removed the hyphen in the name and it went from XJ-S to XJS, which of course ran from 91 to 96 and then ushered in the iconic XK8, which I've already talked about on the channel. Those last cars had some significant changes as well. Now those ones you can tell apart pretty easily visually. They have the body coloured bumpers, they're more aerodynamic. They look a little bit more Americanized in a general sense. They kind of have that more soft looking impact style bumper, which you often see on classics that get shipped over to the States for safety reasons, and unfortunately for the American models, you do often see a slight drop in power and performance as well. Now, speaking to the drop in power and the time period that these come from, Jaguar did launch the car and push this huge V12 during an oil crisis. Not necessarily a wise choice, but the car still managed to be in production for over 20 years, so it can't have been that bad. It was also used extensively in motorsport. Trans Am, of course, TWR got their hands on them, Lister got their hands on them, and you could probably argue, and I haven't fully looked into this, but I would imagine it's to some degree true, that the Lister 7-litre version, sometimes called the Lister Le Mans, more than likely was kind of a learning curve to make the Lister Storm as much of an awesome machine as it was. Now, these cars, even if you don't like them, like me for example, not being an aficionado of XJS's or even a super fan, I still appreciate what this car put down because it led to the XK8, which led to the XKR, and even led to the F-Type after that, you could say. So it's a core part of Jaguar's history. And that's the interesting thing, because for a car that is so important to Jaguar and has so much rich history behind it and around it and such a long production run, they don't really have much value. And I think that's the thing that's going to change, because maybe it's the styling, maybe it's the performance, maybe it's the fact that if you put this in a lineup with all of the other collectible Jag GTs and sports cars, if we're honest, it's probably one of the least pretty of the bunch. If you compare it to something like an E-Type before it, or even an XK after it, it's not as curvy, it's not as swoopy, it's not as overtly a sports car. It kind of feels like what it originally was in terms of its design, which is an evolution of the XJ platform, hence the name. That doesn't mean it's a bad car though, and in a funny kind of way, I would actually describe this as being like two distinctly different kinds of car mashed together. And this is of course just my opinion, but for those who have driven these or own them, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this take. And that is, imagine if you took the essential concept of something like the Bentley Continental GT, which of course I talked about here on the channel, magnificent machine, this idea of a massive engine, effortlessly fast GT luxury car, but then squeeze all of that philosophy into something that's kind of like a 60s or 70s muscle car from America. That's kind of what the XJS feels like to me. It's got that wide, low, almost boxy profile of a muscle car, but British muscle in this case, but then with that huge, very British Grand Tourer V12 motor underneath. To me, that's the best way I would describe it. Is the handling a little bit floaty? Well, yes. But in many ways, I actually found this really impressive in terms of how well it holds up. The brakes, in particular, are shockingly good for a classic. On the old Rolls I'd driven, I mentioned that the brakes weren't the best. On the Cortina, they were a little soft and kind of slowed the car down when they felt like it. This one has actually got pretty good stopping power, especially for its age. Now, speaking to its age, this one is incidentally a lovely example, which is always lovely to have in a review because it means I get to really feel what the car should feel like, rather than a rundown example. This one, for instance, has been in dry storage since like 2013, only taken out once a year for an MOT, so it's about as close to an actual running museum piece as you could realistically get, and the price shows that, being up around 20 grand. Not that long ago, you couldn't give these away, and I think that that is what is happening to these cars. It's starting to have that XKR effect, in effect, wherein last year and the year before XKRs started to go up in value. I could see this happening, and it certainly already is in some cases, happening to this car as well. And it makes sense if you think about it. Many people who want a classic aren't going to be interested in something like the XKR that I had, or maybe even the torpedo shape, XK1 or X100 I should say, in XK8 form from the 90s. If you want a proper classic, well, this really is the last one. Everything after this is modern, in effect, even the late 90s models. Before that, though, you're paying way more money for something like an E-Type. So this, it's a sweet spot, really, and that's not going to stay the same way. What then in terms of downsides? Well, it's not a perfect car. Of course, the handling cannot compete with a modern machine, so don't even buy it if you're looking to do that. The performance, although effortless, as I said, I will definitely say feels much more akin to being kind of a really classy cruiser rather than a high-performance two-door sports car. Because it's not a sports car, it's a GT, so it makes sense that it would feel that way. But why I say that, though, is because to me this feels like the pendulum swings more and more on the luxury end than with some GTs. I'm sure you guys are familiar with how different the concept of a GT car can be. Just imagine two examples that I talked about earlier. Compare a Jag XKR to a Bentley Continental GT. They're both GT cars, but they are very, very different approaches to it. One is much lighter, more raw, more simple, more old school. The other is packed full of technology and insanely heavy and massive. They're very different ideas, but approaching the same problem, if you will. This feels more like the Bentley end, for better or worse. So if you are looking for something to throw around the back lanes, an XJS might not be the car for you. If you're looking for a car to cruise around the coast with the top down, with quite a lot of stuff in the boot, and maybe behind the front seats as well, since the convertible is changed to a two-seater instead of the four-seater hardtop, then it may well be the car for you. Now, speaking to the changes that happened with the different models, I already mentioned, of course, the high-efficiency engine improvements to that 5.3 litre V12, but also, in this same generation of car, they introduced the straight 6 engine, as well, a 3.6 litre, and you can sometimes find those, well, of course, on the market as well, so it depends what kind of experience you want. Funnily enough, that actually kind of reminds me of the Aston Martin DB7, with its also choices of straight 6 and V12. Then with the full facelift, body-coloured bumpers to end the production run, they improved the engine size up to a 4 litre straight 6, 6 litre V12, but not really massive differences in performance. The most notable one of that generation, I would say, is probably the TWR fettled XJS, which is a 160 mile an hour car, much more expensive than most of the other XJSs on the market, and for good reason. It's seriously quick, and at the time, a number of motoring journalists and outlets actually said it was better than many of its rivals. So it proved really the essential ability, the underlying potential that this platform had, as did the numerous successful racing campaigns which it went in as far afield as Australia at Bathurst. Ultimately, it's not the kind of car which I would have gone out of my way to try and review, but I'm definitely glad that I did drive one, because of two things. One, it shows a level of charm, regardless of if I'm a fan of the model overall, that a modern car, even my own preferred XKR, does not have. It just doesn't feel the same when you're sat in a modern car as it does with a classic. That's just the way it is for me. Even if I don't like the classic, it's still the case. It feels more historied, like it has more personality and there's more of a story to tell. But also because this is massively important to the family tree of what made mine as enjoyable to me as it is. It's the granddaddy of the XKR. And in fact, much of what made this car what it was directly carried over into the XK8s of the initial torpedo shape. So ultimately that's it for my thoughts on these. Of course prices will vary quite a bit, so it really depends on what you're looking for. The age, the spec, the engine, open top, closed top. There are so many choices, which is not surprising for a 20 plus year production run. Ultimately that's it for my thoughts though. Of course, if you are an owner of one of these now, if you used to have one, maybe if you're just an aficionado of it or a fan, tell me your thoughts down below. Do you love them, hate them, disagree or agree, or think there's something I missed about the car? And of course, if you want to check out more reviews, such as the classics which I mentioned, then you can find those here in the Beards and Cars playlist on the channel. And until next time, I'll see you then with more. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.